In this video, I am breaking down the 5 most common mistakes made by real estate investors throughout the course of their career. This is one you're going to want to pay attention to. Alright guys, welcome back to another real estate investment video from myself, Gavin J. Gallagher. So I'm going over the 5 most common mistakes made by real estate investors, and each of these mistakes are things that I've done myself over the course of my 25-year career. Some of them are going to seem a little bit obvious, but I'm putting them in there because they can be something that creeps in, and actually it's a mistake that gets made even though it sounds super obvious. So let's get into the 5 most common mistakes that real estate investors make. Number 1 is making assumptions. Number 2 is simply not stress testing your financial analysis. Number 3 is a very simple one and a very obvious one, but it's simply paying too much. Number 4 is falling in love with a deal or an opportunity. And number 5, and this is a big one, not doing sufficient due diligence on your selected tenant. By the way, I have actually put chapters below, so if you're pretty impatient and you just want to get straight to the chapter that's interesting for you, check the description below and you'll see the various chapters laid out. Let's go back to mistake number 1, and that is making assumptions. Now, what do I mean by making assumptions? There's a number of mistakes you can make by making assumptions. And one of the most common ones is simply making an assumption that a deal is going to get done just because the buyer or the seller or the tenant or whoever it is, the counterparty to the agreement, has said that they're going to do something. They don't always go through with it. Now, take it from me, unless a piece of paper is signed and in your possession, the deal is not done. And anything can happen. And if you make assumptions, that can really badly impact you. I've made assumptions where I've assumed that because a tenant said something or did something that they're definitely going to go ahead and sign an agreement or something like that, and they've pulled out of deals. I've had situations where people have sat down with me, agreed heads of terms, agreed a memorandum of understanding, and then they leave. They say they come back next week and sign the final agreement, and you never hear from them again. I mean, completely upped and vanished. I've also made assumptions around growth of the rental market. You're expecting certain growth. Assumptions around interest rates, assumptions. Just be careful with the assumptions that you make. All right, number 2 is not adequately stress testing your financial analysis. Now, this is slightly tied to the assumptions before, but what I'm getting at here is the overall financial assessment that you have created. A lot of the time, a development or an investment starts with a piece of paper, and you make various assumptions based on the amount of rent you're going to get, the price that you're paying, the market strength, the interest rates that you're paying, the length of time it's going to take. All of this stuff is put in, and these are the assumptions I mentioned earlier. Now, when you're looking at all of those figures on a piece of paper, you've got to be very careful to stress test those numbers. So let's take a pessimistic view of the analysis. What happens if your costs increase by 8 to 10%? What happens if interest rates jump by 10 to 25%? What happens if a tenant doesn't sign an agreement for 6 months? What happens? A lot of things can go wrong in a deal, and it's very important that you cover them in your initial analysis. There's an old carpentry saying, cut once, measure twice. And that is something that you can do on paper at the analysis stage of any deal. Measure twice. Do plenty of assessment on your financial analysis. Make sure that you've looked at everything, that anything that is subject to fluctuations has been tested. You cannot expect the deal to follow exactly as per your financial analysis. So you've got to go and check those numbers. All right, number 3 is a real easy one, and that's simply paying too much. Now, it sounds super obvious, but when you are stuck in say a bubble or a very hot market, it's very, very quick and easy to go and overpay for a property. property. You can get over enthusiastic about a deal. You can get caught up in the enthusiasm and the kind of heat of the market. What you've got to do is look at the deal from first principles. And if you go back to how much a property can rent for, that will give you an indication of how much you're paying for the property. In the past, a big mistake that I made, I got comparables of other prices paid in the area, and of course they were all overpaying as well. What you need to do is break it back to first principles, and that is, if you're buying for a certain price, you need to have a certain yield. In order to make it financially work for you. Then what does that rent look like? What's the amount of rent per year? Now have a look at that and question, can a tenant actually pay a rent like that in, say, a downward market? After the 2008 financial crisis, there was a huge retraction in the market. People stopped spending money, and all of a sudden you had shops that were expected to pay $4,000 and $5,000 a month in rent. It just wasn't possible. You got to make sure that whatever the rent that is there, that there's some comfort level, and that if the market falls off a bit, that there's going to be plenty of room for survival and a little bit of a buffer there to be able to cover the rent. Number 4 is falling in love with that deal or opportunity. And this is an easy one to get caught up in because you see something in it and you're a creative person. You like the idea of doing something special with this particular property. Maybe you've got a really spectacular vision for what can be done here. Just be careful that you don't get too emotional. Now, I've done a video about this previously and it's called the 4 E's, and 2 of them are the ego and the emotion, and that can very much control how you think about a deal. So be very careful not to fall in love with a deal. You have to be prepared to walk away if the numbers do not stack up. And sometimes they don't stack up and you will reluctantly have to accept that, sorry, this deal can't be done. If you're in love with that deal, you're going to find it difficult to walk away. And finally, it's the due diligence on that tenant that you have selected to come in. It's very, very easy for tenants to go and put on a bit of a show and put on and kind of impress you with how great they are, how strong their business is. Just because somebody is saying it does not mean it's true. And you got to go and dig into their financial accounts, financial statements. It needs to be up-to-date financial statements. I've got guys saying, here you go, and they're like 3 years old. A lot of these are legally required to be filed with the tax office. So you should have the latest set of accounts that are legally required in the tax office. Anything below that, I'd be just a little bit nervous. The other thing you got to do is check references. Go and talk to landlords. Read between the lines when it comes to letters from previous landlords. The best thing to do is actually pick up the phone and speak to the landlord. If you're reading between the lines, you can sometimes see that the letter from the previous landlord is not a recommendation. Believe me, I understand. If you're struggling to find a tenant and one comes along, you're very, very inclined to just say, finally, and just let's sign this person up and let's get the rent flowing. But you can get into so much grief and hassle down the road when a tenant stops paying rent or is unable to pay rent or simply refuses. There are really good, honest tenants out there, but there are also guys that just simply want to mess you around and want to play games with you. So do your due diligence. All right, guys, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please consider gently tapping the like button down below. If you want to get more videos of this type, well then please hit the subscribe button and join our community. Now the best way to be part of the community is to leave a comment below. While you're there, why don't you have a look at any other comments that people have left and consider leaving a comment for them as well. So I'm going to ask you a question. Have you guys made a mistake in the past? Leave us a comment below with just some of those mistakes so that we can learn from your experience as well. We'll see you next week. Okay, so let's get into the 5 reasons, not reasons. I've had situations where people have come in, sat down with me, that you're not simply assuming one what? By the way, guys, are you finding